The American dream is the ideal that every U.S. citizen should have the equal opportunity to succeed, to become prosperous through hard work and determination, and often includes some form of private property ownership. I can remember being the youngest of 12. Essentially, our family had nothing. But when we were raised in the house that my grandfather built, it was taught to me early, from my father, from my mother, that owning your piece of the American dream is something we should all strive for. The concept of the American dream finds its roots in our history, beginning in colonial times. As you all know, our founding fathers fought the American Revolution for independence from tyranny and to combat injustice. Americans saw homes taken over by British soldiers and their goods taxed without consent, which was essentially a limit on their private property and their livelihoods without recourse. Even before the first United States Constitution, private property rights were protected in the Declaration of Colonial Rights. The First Continental Congress explicitly stated that Americans are entitled to life, liberty, and property, and they have never ceded to any sovereign power a right to dispose of either without their consent. Not only did they wage war for our freedom, but our founding fathers had the foresight to stop the government from taking private property by including the same types of protections in the U.S. Bill of Rights, which we rely on today. We all know the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, which states, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." This provision was written to protect citizens from unreasonable government seizure of property as they experienced as colonists. As a nation and over the course of our history, we have fought wars and continue to expand our influence and drive forward on new land. The United States annexed territory through actions like the ratification of the Northwest Ordinance, which expanded the country into the Ohio River Valley, and the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubled the size of the United States. The U.S. even went as far as to pass the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of public land to any settler willing to move less, as long as they maintained a continuous residence on that property. The fact that this was even an adequate incentive, think about it, for a young man or woman to take his family out west because of the enticement of the ability to own their land, demonstrates just how valuable private property is to our society. According to this history, we developed a cultural obsession with the American dream, rooted in the core principle of private property ownership. Private property that belongs to you and not the government. However, the American dream is under attack. I know this firsthand, representing a district in the great state of New York. In December 2014, I saw our governor, Andrew Cuomo, unilaterally banned hydraulic fracturing, which is essentially the process to develop natural gas rights on individual property owners in the state of New York. Countless constituents approached me, wondering when their voices would be heard. They saw my district borders the Pennsylvania state border. They saw within eyesight, across the border, the development of natural gas on people's property and the economic revitalization and rebirth occurring throughout the rural areas of northern Pennsylvania. I sat in the kitchen of a homeowner in the state of Pennsylvania, and we were talking about the development of natural gas and what it represented. And I was invited there by his daughter, who was adamantly opposed to the development of that natural gas. But her father said to me, "I know that she's opposed to it, but this was my grandfather's farm. And that natural gas development, that well pad that you see on the back 40, is putting her kids through college and securing a college degree without any debt." You talk about using your property rights to advance a personal and noble cause. Many of our farmers were already struggling in New York to make ends meet, threatening the next generation of farmers where they were unable to make do by just working the land. We in New York were hoping for the economic boom that natural gas development would come to our area and offer. and yet the development never came. One of my constituents, Neil Vitale, one of my personal guests at the recent State of the Union that President Obama gave, he highlighted it best when he said he could see from his property the lands of Pennsylvania literally yards away, being developed and prosperity and revitalization occurring within his sites. And he asked the question to me, why does the state of New York think people leave in droves to go elsewhere when we adopt policies that take away their rights and force them to go? Stories like Neil's eventually came pouring in. These conversations developed into a broader discussion about widespread and fundamental property rights throughout our district. Then I began to hear from landowners across the nation concerned about government intrusion into their lives. I heard stories from residents of Minnesota concerned about the proposed buffer zone rule changes, which requires mandatory setbacks from bodies of water. Estimates show that 125,000 acres could be taken out of production by this rule. These acres are owned by people, by Americans. I heard from a farmer in Pennsylvania being taken to court by his own government as a result of normal farming practices, which he had undertaken for years. I heard from a farmer in California where federal agents walked onto his land unannounced, and the subsequent years of legal battles and wrangling with regulators that followed when all he wanted to do was farm his land that was passed down to him by his father. Landowners across our nation are being negatively affected by government intrusion, and it weighs them down. When they try to fight back, they spend their money fighting expensive legal proceedings against the seemingly limitless resources of the government, simply to keep the property they have owned for decades, that they have paid taxes on, and that they have maintained. To me, this is inherently unfair to all hardworking Americans. After 200 years of legal protection and running directly contrary to our history, our culture, and our values, this pattern of overreach by our government was highlighted by a singular court case, the case we're here to talk about today, Kelo versus New London. And as you heard from Professor Epstein, the facts of the case are well known. The city of New London confiscated Suzette Kelo's home so a private corporation could build a new facility and utilize the guise of economic development to do so. The government claimed that seizing the property under eminent domain was necessary to complete a redevelopment project. In a perversion of the interpretation of the Fifth Amendment, in my opinion, the government repeatedly cited the Takings Clause as justification for taking Ms. Kelo's private property. The Supreme Court held, as we know, in a 5-4 decision that the government was able to seize the properties in question and transfer private property between owners in the name of economic development. Bluntly, this is not what our founding fathers had in mind when they drafted the Fifth Amendment. If they were willing to wage war over something as important as the fundamental right to private property and economic freedom, who are we to trample on these rights? It is boggling to me to see that our own government would use a singular court ruling to defy, undermine, and even sabotage this inherent and uniquely American principle. Today, 10 years after the Kelo decision, the property where Suzette's home once stood is vacant and a desolate lot. After spending millions of dollars of taxpayer money and forcing several hardworking families from their homes, this economic development plan was a complete failure. The abandoned 90-acre lot in the heart of New London is a chilling example of the danger posed by government overreach and intrusion into the lives of American citizens and intervention into the free market. It fundamentally begs the question, if the government decides to undertake economic development as a public use and take your property to do so, what else can the government do? Where does it end? This is just the problem. The possibilities are endless. Even more troublesome than agricultural impacts is the problem in urban settings. And I don't believe this gets as much attention as it really deserves to get. Where the power to take property is frequently abused by government for unnecessary and unreasonable purposes, and as one of our panelists will say, Dr. Soman, which is so artfully and in a positive way highlighted that this type of development, this type of taking, transferring property to private interests for economic development tends to victimize the poor, racial minorities, and the politically weak. Dr. Soman points out that eminent domain takings disproportionately occur in poor and minority neighbors, which inflicts great harm on the individual landowners and their communities. 10 years later, we are still fighting against the implications of the Kelo decision. Just this week in the THUD bill, appropriations bill, we had language to push back on this expansive overreach of the U.S. government. We can and are chipping away at this decision, piece by piece. But ultimately, we need real reform. For the sake of our landowners, the constitutional right to private property must be defended. We in Congress must do more. We need to protect these fundamental property rights of all Americans. That is why I partnered with many of my colleagues in Congress to bring attention to these matters. I formed the Private Property Rights Caucus with members from Maine, Alabama, to California. The Private Rights Caucus provides a platform to educate members of Congress on this issue, demonstrates how landowners across the country are being adversely affected, and discuss practical solutions to protect the constitutional rights of all property owners as Americans. I authored and co-sponsored the Defense of Property Rights Act. The bill will promote government accountability and will offer protection for property owners across the country. This provides citizens with an opportunity to seek redress in court when government action significantly impairs the value of their property or unreasonably restricts the use of their property. A right of relief Americans do not enjoy today. The legislation hopefully will force government to think twice before acting and introduces accountability in a system that has often been abused by government to the detriment of landowners. The Defense of Property Rights Act is an important and necessary step towards keeping government in its proper role. As a Congress, it is our duty to make sure government is kept in check, and we must not be complacent when the government infringes on our individual liberties and restricts our constitutional rights. We must ensure that government does not extend beyond the limitations placed on its power. I'm reminded often in Congress, as the Scottish historian and philosopher David Hume once said, "It is seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once." And yet, unfortunately, hard-fought rights established by the blood of our founding fathers were lost with the drop of a gavel roughly 10 years ago, and they only continue to erode. We must coordinate our efforts to provide the proper protections for property owners to ensure those sacrifices were not suffered in vain. Together, let's put a stop to the erosion of our liberty and the degradation of this essential human right that fuels the American dream.